T-H-E, Mr. Bob Roth, in an interview in Chickasha, Oklahoma, May 20th, 1976. We're interviewing for the Living Legends of Oklahoma Christian College, and this is a project of the Oklahoma Historical Society. I'm going to ask Mrs. Dees to tell us something about what she's going to talk about. And would you give us your name first and spell it for us?
Dana, D-A-N-A, Dews, D-E-W-S.
And your husband was?
I am a maiden lady is the term.
Oh, I had your name down, Mrs. I'm sorry. On the other tape I made, I put it in as Mrs. Okay. I've asked her to just brief us in a little bit, although we have another tape on her. I have asked her to brief us in just a little bit on her family. And then, since she's one of the organizers and officers of the Historical Society of this county, we'd like for her to go from there on what she thinks is most beneficial for history to keep. Ms. Dees?
This is primarily taken from a diary kept by my maternal grandfather, George Johnston.
J-O-H.
Excuse me, sorry. His name was, his father's name was George Johnston. His mother was Chastina, C-H-A-S-T-I-N-A, Mathewson, M-A-T-H-E-W-S-O-N, Haywood, H-A-Y-W-O-O-D. They came to Iowa, where my grandfather, Dr. Daniel Mathewson Johnston, was born. He grew up in Iowa. He studied medicine at Ann Arbor, Michigan, took his degree there, and became restless, as many people did in those days. He was concerned with having a career in medicine, had an older half-brother who had come to Oklahoma, George Johnston, who was then living at Lexington on the Canadian River. At the time of the run into Oklahoma, Dr. Johnston had decided that he would troop up and down looking for a place to practice medicine. He first had gone down into Texas, thinking the climate would be more pleasant, and he was tired of Iowa winters. But as he stood on the beach down at Galveston, where he went by train, his cane kept going farther and farther into the sand, and he decided that was not for him. This was before one of the great hurricanes, and he was forever grateful he did not stay. He also toured in the South, in Louisiana and Mississippi, and stayed in homes with people, treated them, as he said, with either quinine or whiskey, whichever would solve the problem. That's what he used. He had no antibiotics, nothing of that sort. He enjoyed the leisurely life, but he felt their brains were becoming sodden from their daily bits of, I suppose, Southern planter or whatever they were drinking at that time. So he came back up, and at that time they were beginning to open up the territories, the Indian Territory, and he had always calculated wherever the railroad would go, there would be prosperity. So he decided to make the run into Oklahoma, and he burdened himself with as little as he could, but he had a good horse, he had a small wagon, and his brothers helped him to get across the Canadian with everything they had, and they set him up in camp where he could cross at the time of the great run into Oklahoma, which would have been April 22nd of 1889. And it was at high noon. They shot off the guns all up and down, primarily the Canadian at that time. And thousands and thousands of people, of course, made a run. And he spoke about the fact that, as he described them, 45 hombres, hard-looking fellows, came down river to the camp riding mules and ponies. And the leader said they had been prospecting for gold in the Wichita Mountains, but they were going to make the run. The river being almost full, it was quite difficult for the men to go across, and as it happened, he stopped and befriended a young boy who had crossed on a pony. The pony drowned. And I will quote, using the first name I to make this simpler, if that's convenient. I turned ahead my watch 30 minutes early, which was a sneaky trick, but I suspect many of them did it. But they chased the last of the cattle coming back across to clear them out of that territory. And then all the people started going across the river with much cussing and yelling, spurring of ponies, and slipping of the mules on the mudland. And as we reached the quicksands, which the animal knew, they did their damnedest to reach shore on solid footing. All made it but one boy on a small pony. The pony was a poor swimmer, went under several times with the boy yelling for help, but as it reached the sand, it gave up the fight and died. So two of the cowboys tied their ropes together and threw them to the boy, yelled to him to tie it to the saddle horn, and cut the saddle loose from the pony and hang on. He did so, and they pulled him out. He was crying and scared half to death. They held a short consultation, all of us, 8 or 10 of us, on what to do to help. We were already on the second bench of the riverbank and had a good view of, quote, the promised land, so they knew they could go ahead very quickly. I suggested he stay where he was, stake out a claim right there, and everybody agreed. So I gave him my flag, told him to stick it in anywhere, put his saddle on it, or stay there with him. I gave him dry matches and 1 leg of jerky venison, and told him I was sure someone would come along to help. I hated to leave him, but sentiment was not known in that country, especially at that time. I left and rode up to the top of a small elevation and had a front seat in the great amphitheater of the world's greatest run for land in the United States. The sight was inspiring, novel, and wicked. Everyone for himself and damn the other fellow. Vain, selfish humanity in a beautiful world. On that slight elevation, I sat on my horse and saw hundreds and thousands riding for the home they had thought about in Oklahoma. Men, women, children, all in a crazy race for land. Wagons, buggies, buckboards, wheelbarrows, pushcarts, and foot, all in a wild jumble. A horse would fall, a wheel on a buggy would come off, or a pony step into a badger hole, break his leg, and an owner would have to shoot the horse. He would then take his saddle, take his flag, and ride or walk off again. No one stopped to help anyone, man or woman. It was root, hog, or die. Every minute or so, someone would stop, shoot off his gun, and stick in his flag. He had located his claim, and it meant keep off. I saw a light wagon upset and throw the entire family out and all the contents. The man was not hurt, so he ran back a short distance, picked up a kid, helped the woman to her feet, stuck his flag in, and was ready to camp. I rode slowly on, going north by now. The mass of the riders had gone upriver. Some stopped and fired off their guns and stuck up their flags. Some had no flags, so they stuck their red bandana or shirt tail on a bush or a rosin tree, all looking for some stone that might mark their land into sections. Every settler looked wild and woolly and would shout at the least provocation. I rode toward a man to ask if he had found any cornerstone or any other marks, and when I got within some 300 feet of him, he stood behind his horse and shouted, "Go on, don't get any nearer than you are, you son of a..." I didn't like his Sunday school talk, but I did want to get further acquaintance with his kind. He looked half-starved, but I knew he would shoot a squirrel's eye out, and I wanted to observe him. But I controlled my temper, and I moved on. As I approached this country, every quarter section had a resident. There were deer, antelope, and plenty of jackrabbits. I had lots of chances to kill an antelope or wild turkey, but what would I do with it? I had enough jerky to last for 3 days if necessary, and I never enjoyed killing for the sport of it. At sundown, I reached Kingfisher, another crazy, milling community, a stinking mass of excited humanity. I envied my beaver friends whom I had enjoyed watching. People poured into that mob all night. I staked out some lots by moonlight and found them mostly in the street, according to a survey of the town. That night, one of my lots was fairly located on the creek bank, a stinking little dribble, and smelled of sulfur, and the water was gypsum. It was like taking a dose of castor oil. Some wise guy had bought a tank of fair water and was selling it at 5 cents a drink or a tin cup full, and I took a dime's worth. We held a mass meeting at 6 p.m., elected a mayor and a city marshal, city clerk, and no secretary. So everybody tried to talk, hundreds at one time, and no one succeeded very well. They all wanted to be boss. Most of them said, "I'm from Texas," and that seemed to be all the credentials they needed. Some were finally disgusted with Texas, and at last one man had the courage to say, "I'm from Kansas," and then acted as if he would like to dodge behind a wagon. All Texas was Democratic at that time, and Kansas was Republican. But northern Oklahoma was populated mostly by northern men, who were Republican also. After several votes, the master of ceremonies proclaimed the Kansas man elected. Amidst shouting and yelling, he was elected mayor of Kingfisher. I looked for trouble, as Kansas and Texas were always fighting over politics. A messenger was sent to the camp of the soldiers about 6 miles up Uncle Sam's Creek. They came charging down and went right into the town camp and went right to the border of the town plat. I think they did save a bad fight. Resentment toward Kansas ran high, and as every man was armed, it would have been a serious business as the Texans predominated. The soldiers did throw oil on the troubled waters. I took my horse and gun, got my best lot, and staked him on it. I used my cat skin for a bed, my saddle blanket for a cover, and lay down to rest. It had been a full day, a 40-mile ride under exhausting conditions, which made me sleepy. But nix for sleep in that mob. I don't think anyone slept much that night with shooting in the air and shouting all night. I did sleep a little near morning, about sunup. Then when I woke, I found a dry buffalo chip under my bed and started a small fire. I had a coffee pot tied to my saddle and made me a strong concoction and called it coffee. But it was a little like Mark Twain said about his coffee made of jiffy water. It was too technical. I had plenty of venison, and it is surprising how nourishing venison can be eaten alone and without salt. The old-timers never salted it. I think the reason was it doesn't make you thirsty, as quite often they had to make a dry camp. It was a good breakfast, coffee and jerky, a little short on vitamins but long on proteins. I sauntered up to town, but did not carry my Winchester, as some guy would snatch it. I left it tied to my horse securely. The first 2 tents had signs on them, one eats and the other bank. I was afraid of both of them. Ptomaine in the eats, and I imagined the Dalton boys would attend to the bank, and they did. The bank was robbed 2 weeks later by 4 men in daylight, supposed to be the Dalton boys. They just stepped in and helped themselves, regardless of the soldiers, and were gone on their fine horses before the soldiers could get saddled up. From there, they went over to Red Rock, over east, and robbed a store and post office and killed the postmaster. The U.S. Marshals pursued them and killed 2, one George Cochran and another Zim Zip. I sold my lot for $150 and left the same day at noon, and the sale of the lot paid for the expedition of the run into Oklahoma. I didn't want any more of it. I was hungry for civilization.
That's good.
Blarney and stories.
Wow, do you think?
There are others. It's all right. It's all right.
Oh, we haven't been on.
No, I have.
Mm-hmm.
Then when she was telling us about we turned it off and she finished reading the book.
Mm-hmm. Oh, put it in your mind for your own recollection of some notes. Our society is a somewhat functioning society, let me put it that way.
That's what I wanted with the Historical Society.
The Historical Society does concern Grady County, so we are involved with Rush Springs, Tuttle, Minko.
Yes.
And that is the reason for obtaining people from
We
these
had some
towns.
background on Tuttle and Minko, didn't we?
Awfully glad.
Why don't you give us
Rush Springs.
the directors or the officers of the...
All right. Miss Annie Hampton, Hampton, is the president of the Grady County Historical Society. The vice president is George Miller, and he is our publicity director, since he's one of the local newspaper people. Mr. Garland Wasson, Wasson, is our treasurer. We have a number of board members, innumerable board members. We have a committee on taping and a committee on written recording. We have a committee, I'm the genealogical committee, and we have a real fine collection of family records. And from this, we are assisting Mrs. Voigt in her project of recording the name and birth date and death date of every individual who was in Grady County prior to statehood. That is our long-time project. On this, I've been assisted by Bessie Thomas and by Maud Dews. And let me me see, we have a historical places committee. That would be Miss Mary Bailey. And we have our programs have been primarily instructive in nature to teach us how to do the caring for problems. We have had a program on care books. We're trying to learn how to preserve our books and restoring them, and that's a project. Had a man who originates Western and country music, and he was our entertainment. But he knows many old songs, so I was very pleased. Some of it was taped, yes. And then last summer we went down to a place at Rush Springs. Mrs. James arranged that. It's out in the country, a rock which has marks on it. We hesitate to say they're really old, but we think they are. And Dr. Rossler Hinton at Rush Springs has been a great help to us. He will search out a project and tell us about it, and we'll go look at it and check on it.
Have you notified the archaeology department?
Yes, they did it years ago, and they were very interested. And Minko is our next subject we're working on. We were very pleased. Mr. and Mrs. Marion Gurley, G-U-R-L-E-Y, at Minko, found an old cemetery, Oak Creek Cemetery. Outside Minko. It was an old family cemetery. They helped to get it cleaned up. They developed an interest in it. They even obtained an oil lease for it to support it. So the Oak Creek Cemetery outside Minko is in the process of having a fence. It will be cleaned up. The stones will be remarked, and it will be self-supporting, which is a great project. Isn't that great? The Gurleys, they're very modest people. I would like to have had them today because his father is quite elderly and knows them back. Minko needs to be done right in Minko. If it could be done with him. There are people we could work with over there, but so many others are quite elderly. Those people are elderly and they're fragile. And the sister is getting to the point because she is and full of more stories. She is our prime and joy down here. Thank you so much for listening to me, Miss Hughes. And we've had a wonderful day today, and we appreciate the ones that you have brought in for us. This is Mary B. Roberts and Mr. Bob
Roth.
Roth, R-O-T-H-E, signing off. Thank you.